a big factor. I will say, however, that I think they're happiest in a soil that's somewhere between 6.8 and 7.2. So, like most fruit trees, that's where they're happy. The soil does not need to be good. Indeed, if you start improving the soil considerably, then you're going to end up with these big, gorgeous trees that aren't producing anything at all. So they love to grow in the worst of the worst soil, and I think we have plenty of that in Texas. So I think it's another reason that they'll do well in Texas. The fact that they do reach out like this and well beyond the canopy is how they can grow in my deep sand, and I've got what's affectionately known as sugar sand. You're shaking your head, you must be from out that way. Peanuts, I was told, will grow there, not olive trees. So, or they'll also grow in rocks. So that's why they do so well in Turkey and Greece and in hill country, because they can latch on to the rocks and find their way. The limiting factor for olive trees, there are two things that you have to worry about. And the one factor is, does your soil drain well?
What's that?
Does the soil drain well?
Okay.
If the drainage is not good, the olive tree is going to develop all sorts of root problems, and it will begin to die. So that's one of the limiting factors. The other limiting factor is temperature. If you're in an area where it gets down to 10 degrees most winters, then don't think about growing the olive tree. I know that in Texas we have these blue northers blow in, and it can drop to 10 degrees every few 25 to 50 years. But we can't, I made the risk decision that I wasn't going to base my planting on that. It can happen also in Spain, and has, and it can happen in Italy, and has. And what they do is those trees that are gone, they just replace them. And it puts you back a couple of years, but you haven't lost everything. So those are the two limiting factors. They adore heat. In fact, they're growing in areas like Iraq, where it's 120 degrees right now, and they're doing just fine. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, different areas in the Middle East, they do fine. The temperature goes very high. It probably took about 5 years before we began to see any fruit. An olive tree will produce 35 to 45 pounds of fruit a year, and sometimes even heavier than that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So about 5 years ago, we began to see fruit, and it just kept building and just kept building. And last year, we had a phenomenal year. It was wonderful. And we were just so excited. In fact, I went out and bought a press. Well, guess what happened this year? I think I jinxed it. We have now, the trees are now mature enough that they've gone into alternate bearing. And so if you have a very heavy year, then you'll have a very light year. So in a few minutes, we'll talk about what you need to do to prune your trees in order to prevent that from happening.
To prevent what?
Alternate bearing from happening. But first I just want to talk to you about initially planting the tree and what to do initially, and then once it gets producing, we'll talk about that. Okay? When you plant the tree, I want to caution you, do you see the soil line here? It's right where the root flares, isn't it? You have to be very careful about that when you plant the tree. I've got about 20 rows of trees in my orchard that are suffering horribly because the sand has built up to this point on the trees, and we're having to pull that away so that we will not lose the trees. Now, the tree won't die an instant death if it's buried, but it won't produce and it won't flourish. So one of the key factors that you have to do when you plant your tree is make sure that that flare, even if it isn't in the pot, even if it's planted a little bit too deep in the pot, you dig around until you find that root flare and make it level with the soil. Okay? Another thing that we just learned is that, especially in our soil, but in any soil, when you plant the tree, you want to tap it down around the tree, or you'll have air pockets under there. We just planted some lavender out in the orchard, and we went out, and some of the lavender looked great, others, other plants didn't look that great, and we started pressing, and we found that when they had not pressed down to eliminate the air pocket. So that's the next thing that you have to do. And especially this time of year, but really any time of the year, you want to wet the ground very thoroughly for planting. You want to wet the tree very thoroughly before you put it into the ground. You want to pull the roots, if they're in a pot and they're kind of wrapped around, you want to pull the roots away. I know I'm giving you Horticulture 101, but okay. And then, because these are the mistakes that I have made in this venture out at the orchard, and it really causes a lot of grief. But anyway, do that, pull them out gently. You don't want to just hack them, you know, but just sort of pull them out gently. And then once you get it in, you've planted it the correct way, you've tapped it down, and then you water it. And you water it very thoroughly. Now, let's talk about what you do with the hoe. Sure.
You have my shoe.
Sorry, I have to bring a shoe down.
We could just scoot over there out of your way. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Everybody.
I should probably stand over here. Okay. The hoe, of course, you want to dig a ragged hoe. In our case, we can't even dig a ragged hoe. We just kind of throw the sand to the side. And we can use a trowel for most of the plants. We don't have the worries that some of you have in the rock. And
what
then,
size trees are you planting?
we're planting different sizes. We're planting, in our orchard often we plant the little whips that are in 4-inch pots. But we also, if we have 1 gallons that are left over from the season that we haven't sold, we plant those as well out in the orchard. And also, I have some areas where I've got older trees, and I have some 5 gallons that I've been saving, and those will go out to replace so that the orchard looks more even that way. It is not a great idea to plant 5-gallon trees, by the way. I mean, I know in a backyard, but if you're planting an orchard, it's probably best to plant the smaller trees because they'll acclimate, get used to the conditions they're going to grow in. When I first started planting, we used to supplement with all kinds of nutrients in the soil, and that's very old school now. You don't do that. What happens is the tree's pretty smart. It will begin to wrap and wrap because it doesn't want to move out into this less desirable soil, and it will girdle itself, and then you'll have a problem. So the only thing that we put in the soil now is mycorrhizae fungi, and I'll tell you how I came onto that. In the orchard, the prettiest trees in my orchard are around these huge oak trees that I have out there. And I'm talking about a dramatic difference. I have trees in a row, and those that are ringing the oak tree are